You're walking down the street. An officer approaches. "Can I see your ID?" Your heart starts pounding. You freeze. Do you have to show it? What if you don't have it on you? What if you refuse? Most people have no idea when they're legally required to show identification and when they're not. And that confusion can lead to unnecessary arrests, illegal detentions, or worse. I'm Attorney Atlas, and today I'm breaking down exactly when police can demand your ID, when you can legally refuse, and what happens if you get it wrong. Let's dive in. Here's the first thing you need to understand. The answer depends on where you are. The United States does not have a single nationwide rule about ID requirements. Instead, it's controlled by state law, and those laws vary widely. Some states have what are called stop and identify statutes, others don't. But even in states that do, there are strict rules about when police can demand your ID. It's not whenever they feel like it. So let's break this down step by step. First, what is a stop and identify state? A stop and identify state is a state where you are legally required to provide your name, and in some cases, physical identification, if a police officer has reasonable suspicion that you're involved in criminal activity and lawfully detains you. Notice the key words there: reasonable suspicion and lawfully detains you. That means the officer can't just walk up to you randomly and demand your ID. They need a legal reason to stop you in the first place. As of now, there are approximately 24 states with stop and identify laws. These include states like Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Mexico, New York, North Dakota, Ohio, Rhode Island, Utah, Vermont, and Wisconsin. If you're in one of these states and an officer has reasonable suspicion that you've committed, are committing, or are about to commit a crime, and they lawfully detain you, you are required to identify yourself. In most of these states, that means providing your name. In some states, like Arizona and Nevada, you may also be required to show physical ID if you have it. Now here's the critical part. Even in stop and identify states, the officer must have reasonable suspicion first. They can't just stop you because they feel like it. They can't demand ID because you look suspicious or because you're in a high crime area. There has to be specific, articulable facts that suggest you're involved in criminal activity. Examples of reasonable suspicion: you match the description of a suspect in a recent crime. You're in an area where a burglary just occurred and you're carrying a bag at 2 a.m. You're seen running away from the scene of an incident. An officer smells marijuana coming from your person. Examples that are not reasonable suspicion: you're walking in a bad neighborhood. You looked nervous when you saw the police. You refused to answer questions. You're a certain race, age, or wearing certain clothing. If the officer does not have reasonable suspicion, the stop is illegal, and you are not required to provide ID, even in a stop and identify state. So what happens if you're not in a stop and identify state? If you're in a state without a stop and identify law, like California for example, you are generally not required to provide your name or ID unless you're being arrested or you're driving a vehicle. That's right. In California, if you're just walking down the street and an officer asks for your ID, you can legally refuse, as long as the officer doesn't have probable cause to arrest you. But here's where people get confused. Even in non-stop and identify states, if you're driving a car, the rules change completely. If you are operating a motor vehicle, every state requires you to have a valid driver's license and present it upon request during a lawful traffic stop. This is not optional. If you're behind the wheel and a cop asks for your license, you must provide it. Refusing to do so can result in additional charges. But if you're a passenger in the car, the rules are different again. In most states, passengers are not required to show ID during a traffic stop, unless the officer has reasonable suspicion that the passenger is involved in criminal activity. There are a few exceptions. For example, some states, like Arizona, require passengers to provide ID if asked. But in general, passengers have more protection than drivers. Now let's talk about what happens if you refuse to show ID when you're legally required to. If you're in a stop and identify state, the officer has reasonable suspicion, and you refuse to identify yourself, you can be arrested. The charge is usually something like failure to identify or obstruction. It's typically a misdemeanor, but it's still an arrest. It goes on your record, and it can escalate the situation significantly. But here's the flip side. If the officer did not have reasonable suspicion in the first place, and you were unlawfully detained, then the arrest may be thrown out in court. But you still had to go through the arrest process. You still spent time in custody. You still need a lawyer. So what should you actually do when a police officer asks for your ID? Here's the safest approach. Step 1. Stay calm and polite. Do not escalate. Even if you believe the stop is unlawful, the side of the road is not the place to argue about it. Your goal is to protect your rights and get out of the situation safely. Step 2. Ask if you're being detained. This is critical. Politely ask, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" If the officer says you're free to go, then you can leave. You do not have to answer questions. You do not have to provide ID. If the officer says you are being detained, move to Step 3. Step 3. Ask why you're being detained. You have the right to know. Politely ask, "Can you tell me why I'm being detained?" The officer should provide a reason. Listen carefully. If their reason does not sound like reasonable suspicion, for example, if they say, "You looked nervous," or "This is a high crime area," that may be grounds to challenge the stop later. But again, do not argue on the street. Comply under protest if necessary, and let your attorney handle it in court. Step 4. Know your state law. If you're in a stop and identify state and the officer has reasonable suspicion, you are required to provide your name at minimum. Some states require physical ID if you have it. If you're not in a stop and identify state, you can politely decline. "I'm not required to provide ID unless I'm under arrest. Am I under arrest?" Step 5. Do not physically resist. Even if the stop is unlawful, do not pull away, run, or physically resist. That can lead to additional charges, like resisting arrest or obstruction, and it can put you in danger. If the officer insists on seeing your ID and you believe it's unlawful, you can say, "I do not consent to this search or seizure, but I will not physically resist." Then comply, and immediately contact an attorney. Now let's talk about a few special scenarios. Scenario 1. You don't have your ID on you. If you're required to show ID, but you don't have it, you're generally required to provide your name and other identifying information like your date of birth and address. In most stop and identify states, not having physical ID on you is not a crime, as long as you provide your name truthfully. However, if you're driving, not having your license is a separate violation in every state. Scenario 2, you give a false name. This is a crime in every state. If you lie about your identity to a police officer, you can be charged with providing false information, obstruction, or even identity fraud. Never give a fake name. If you're going to refuse to ID, refuse clearly and politely. Don't lie. Scenario 3, the officer threatens to arrest you if you don't show ID. If you're in a stop and identify state and the officer has reasonable suspicion, this is a lawful threat. You are required to identify yourself. If you're not in a stop and identify state or the officer does not have reasonable suspicion, the threat may be unlawful. But again, the street is not the courtroom. Comply if necessary, document everything, and contact an attorney immediately. Let's recap. When you must show ID, you're driving a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. You're in a stop and identify state. You've been lawfully detained, and the officer has reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. You're being arrested. When you do not have to show ID, you're in a non-stop and identify state, and you're not being arrested. You're a passenger in a vehicle, and the officer has no reasonable suspicion about you specifically. The officer has no reasonable suspicion and is just asking randomly, "What to say? Am I being detained, or am I free to go? Can you tell me why I'm being detained? I do not consent to any searches or seizures, but I will not physically resist." If required to ID, provide your name truthfully. If you have physical ID, provide it. If not required, "I'm not required to provide ID unless I'm under arrest." Am I under arrest? Here's the bottom line. The law around ID requirements is complicated. It varies by state. It depends on the circumstances. But knowing the basics can protect you from unlawful detention, unnecessary arrest, and violations of your rights. You don't have to be confrontational. You don't have to be rude. But you do need to know when you're legally required to comply and when you're not. If you found this helpful, subscribe for more breakdowns on your rights during police encounters. Drop a comment if you have questions. And remember, this is educational content, not legal advice. This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Laws vary by jurisdiction. Consult a licensed attorney for advice specific to your situation. I'm Attorney Atlas. Know your rights. Protect your freedom.